Welcome, everyone. I'm Heather Thompson, Director of Internet Marketing for Medmarc. On behalf of Medmarc, thank you for joining us. I'm so pleased to kick off today's presentation titled Ripped from the Headlines, an Eventful Year in Review. Our presenter, Kate Klaus, author of Life Sciences Guidebook, focuses on legal matters faced by participants in the life sciences industry, specifically FDA regulatory compliance. She brings her prior experience in navigating the FDA landscape to Medmarc, where she works with colleagues in-house as well as with policyholders. Ms. Klaus is a graduate of the Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law, and the College of Holy Cross. With that, I am pleased to turn it over to Kate, who will begin today's presentation.
Thanks, Heather. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are going to spend a little time this afternoon taking a look at this unprecedented year and the impact that many of the events we've experienced this year have had and will continue to have on the life sciences industry. I would like to start by taking a look at how this year started off. There were the Australian bushfires, Brexit, the impeachment of Donald Trump. This was all just this past January, even though it feels like decades ago, because there's so much has occurred in the meantime. At this point in the year, FDA's agenda was really fairly straightforward. They were focusing on things like the non-prescription drug and over-the-counter drug process, which had been enhanced through some recent updating of the regulations. They were working on protecting the integrity of imported products. There was a new drug approved to treat peanut allergies in children. And then they were continuing to focus on cybersecurity and innovation. These are all fairly standard topics for FDA. But that all came to a screeching halt when we reached the end of January. And the first confirmed case of coronavirus was identified in Washington State. And by the end of January, the world had completely changed. There were nearly 10,000 worldwide cases, but just a handful in the United States. There were reports that there wasn't community spread in the United States, that the person-to-person contact was not spreading the disease as rapidly here. And of course, we quickly learned how wrong that was. By the end of March, we saw infections skyrocketing. We saw industries shutting down with massive job losses because of lockdowns across the country. And we saw the number of cases skyrocket over just that 2-month period of time from 8 to over 192,000 in the United States alone. At the end of March, we also saw FDA's initial response in terms of keeping their people safe. They suspended routine inspections of domestic facilities. They were continuing to a limited degree do pre-approval inspections. But even those were somewhat limited until there was outcry from industry about them really slowing the process of getting new products to the market down. One of the first things to be impacted in this industry was the standard supply chain. We saw really an immediate issue with this, particularly in response to personal protective equipment for healthcare providers, health workers. They were short on masks, gloves, face shields, gowns, all of these things. And it really was for a number of reasons. Over the last several decades, there had been a shift to relying on outsourcing of the manufacturing of all of this equipment to China and other countries, like Malaysia produces a lot of gloves. A lot of this manufacturing had been shifted out of the United States to countries in Asia. And also because of the pandemic, there was a truly unpredictable demand. There was an increased global demand for these types of products. There also was a financial component to this equipment shortage. Hospitals were having serious budget issues because of the way their cash flow is structured. They really depend on non-emergent surgical procedures, things like joint replacements that had to be canceled because of COVID. All care in hospitals was really limited to the serious critical care inpatient services, which are a drain on hospital resources. They are expensive and they do not bring in a lot of money. There was also a massive increase in the number of uninsured patients who were seeking treatment, particularly because of how the virus has been impacting the population with the frontline workers, really the essential workers, grocery store clerks, and all of the other people who have to be out on the road and cannot be at home to do their job. It tends to correlate with lower paid positions and a lack of employer-provided health care. Some measures that were put into place, and we'll get into this a little bit further as well, were STOPGAP measures that allowed companies to try to get product to the market to support the increased demand. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, issued a declaration under the PrEP Act that stated COVID-19 was a public health emergency, and that subsequent to the declaration, FDA would be able to begin issuing emergency use authorizations. So emergency use authorizations allow companies to market products when they haven't gone through the traditional approval or clearance process. It is limited to public health emergencies. It requires a declaration of a public health emergency by the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And it moves a lot faster than a traditional clearance or approval process. It's intended to be a limited approval because it terminates after the emergency has ended. And the top emergency use authorizations were for diagnostic tests, personal protective equipment, ventilators, which were in incredibly short supply for this disease that is attacking the lungs and the respiratory system, as well as drugs and biologics that could potentially assist in the treatment of COVID. Take a look at diagnostic tests. This was really one of the first places, as you can see from this headline, where the U.S. started to fall behind in addressing the pandemic and its effects on the population. At the very beginning of the health emergency, the production of diagnostic tests was limited to entities that had already been authorized to develop these tests. We saw mostly the molecular-based lab-developed tests, the PCR tests. And the issue with those tests is that they are limited to the labs that create them. So if you created this test, you're going to do the analysis from the test, and the demand was far outstripping capacity. It was causing results to take at least 2 to 3 days, and in some cases more like a week, some even longer, depending upon the area of the country. We also saw the introduction of antigen tests, and these are the rapid results type tests, the kinds of things that you would be able to get at the point of care. The issue with the initial antigen tests is that they had a very high rate of false negatives. In some cases, it was thought to be as high as 50% could be a false negative. So this compounded the problem in a lot of ways. It allowed people who thought they had tested negative for the virus to go out into the community and potentially spread it to family members, coworkers, and anyone else in the community that they encountered. And it also, though it seemed to help alleviate some of the demand for the test, if the result is not accurate, it's really, it's creating more of a problem in the long run, because the people who are exposed to this person who thought they had tested negative may end up sick with the virus and requiring tests themselves. One thing that has changed in the world of antigen tests was in August, Abbott was granted an emergency use authorization for their rapid test. In the months since it was granted the emergency use authorization, the effectiveness of this rapid test has been compared to the PCR-based tests, which are really the gold standard in testing. And it's showing significantly increased accuracy over the early antigen test kits, the early rapid tests. So this is possibly showing us some potential for home-based testing. It uses the same kind of, as you can see in the picture here, the same kind of result as a pregnancy test, where it lights up a control line and then it lights up the test line. So if there's no second line appearing, then your test is going to be negative. You don't have COVID, and you can carry on. So the Abbott test is showing an approximately 93% effectiveness rate compared with the PCR-based test, which is substantially better than the early tests. FDA also issued a number of umbrella EUAs for the personal protective equipment that was so seriously lacking. This is the critical equipment that healthcare providers need to protect themselves when they are in the clinical environment. So the umbrella EUAs were for surgical masks and filtering face piece respirators. So the respirators are things like the N95. These are intended to fit tightly to the face, and they actually offer some protection for the user, whereas the surgical masks are more intended to prevent the wearer from spreading particulate that could carry the virus. It's preventing them from spreading it to other people. So the N95s, both the NIOSH approved and non-NIOSH approved, as well as some imported, were also granted an umbrella EUA. With ventilators, we saw a lot of different industries reaching out to assist in building up the U.S. supply again. We saw manufacturers chosen to make ventilators that were developed by NASA and were really intended for this type of mass health issue, where they might be suited to like a field hospital as opposed to a traditional healthcare hospital setting. This is critical if you're talking about a pandemic where there are field hospitals being established in major cities to account for the number of patients being treated at any given time. We also saw car manufacturers switching over to manufacturing of ventilators, which, as was addressed in the National Law Review, is kind of a concern if, this is a critical piece of equipment. It's a life-sustaining device, so it is considered a much higher risk category under FDA's regulations. Is an auto manufacturer going to be able to manufacture it to the quality standards that we would expect? In the world of drugs and biologics, we also saw a response through off-label use of existing drugs like dexamethasone. It's a steroid that has been proven to be quite helpful with COVID in reducing the inflammation that causes some of the respiratory symptoms. We saw with remdesivir, it began with compassionate use. They also, where the physicians request access to the investigative drug, a drug that has not been approved by FDA yet. Doctors request it. They request permission to access the drug both through FDA and the manufacturer. There's some collaboration there, and it's, we've occasionally encountered clients who are conducting clinical trials on a product and are concerned about product liability risk if they offer an investigational drug for compassionate use. So there are behind the scenes issues there as well that takes a little bit of time. And then once a company agrees to provide it and FDA gives its approval to provide it, you're really talking, several days before a product can be accessed via the compassionate use pathway. So with remdesivir, because it was showing quite a lot of promise with COVID, it received an EUA, an emergency use authorization for limited use. That way, the manufacturer was able to put the product on the market for this limited use in the treatment of COVID. And then once the public health emergency has passed, then the approval would cease and they would be able to market the product under a traditional approval once they've completed clinical trials and received an approval from FDA. Convalescent plasma is another product that is being looked at this time. It is plasma donated by people who have recovered from COVID-19. And the theory is that the antibodies present in the plasma of a recovered patient could carry that immunity to a recipient of the donated plasma. We have also seen some failures and revocations by FDA in the world of drugs and biologics as it relates to COVID. One example is hydroxychloroquine, which was being promoted for a while. I got a lot of traction on the internet, and this is a very old product. I believe it was originally approved for treatment of, I think, lupus, but it was originally thought to have an impact on COVID, but it was more anecdotal. Once they began studying the effectiveness, they found that there was really no benefit from taking the drug, and certainly no benefit that outweighed any potential risks associated with the drug. So providers were advised not to treat COVID patients with hydroxychloroquine. Clinical trials have also been impacted over the course of the last year. There have been concerns about whether clinical trials need to be canceled. And there's been guidance from FDA and other agencies that really focus on patient safety overall and a continuous weighing of risks and benefits. So with a trial, you may wish to consider what the indication is. Are you talking about a cancer drug, or is this something for a non-life-threatening disease? Does the patient need to come to the clinical setting as part of the trial evaluation? Or might it be suitable for a telehealth appointment? There has been guidance that states HHS will permit or will rather relax their enforcement of HIPAA for the purpose of teleconferencing privacy, because they do want to encourage people to avoid the healthcare setting as much as possible unless it is necessary. If it can be done by a video or phone call, then they should do so. But overall, the focus is to be on patient safety. So any modifications that are made to a protocol or deviations from a protocol, of course, they need to be communicated clearly to IRBs overseeing the trials as well as any participants in the trial. But for regulatory purposes, it's really critical for the sponsors and the sites to make sure that they're documenting why the decision was made to make the modification or take the deviation that they did, and that it was rooted in the safety of the patient, and to explain why the choice that they made was safer for the patient than to proceed according to the protocol as it had been drafted originally. There was some concern with clinical trials that if they did not make these modifications, that participants might choose to withdraw from studies because they did not want to risk putting themselves in a clinical setting if they didn't have to. So that was one of the main drivers behind the somewhat looser enforcement of modifications and the focus on telehealth. Moving on to COVID and product liability. Just a little plug for our webinars. In the past, over the course of this year, we've had a number of webinars that have responded to the COVID pandemic. We did a series in March with one of our attorneys from the defense panel that covered the PrEP Act and its liability shield. We did another webinar with a couple of healthcare attorneys on the impact of COVID on clinical trials. And future looking, our last webinar was on a post-election outlook. This was before the election itself, so it sort of gave you a view of either outcome. So I'd encourage you to go back to our archives and check those out. I think there's a lot of really relevant COVID information available to you through those. But to recap on PrEP from our earlier series, the liability shield is really quite strong. It provides nearly blanket immunity, and it is applied quite broadly. It applies to drugs, biologics, devices, products that are intended to counteract an epidemic or pandemic. And it also applies to the manufacturers and distributors of these products, as well as any healthcare providers who administer the products. The legislation was written to encourage the industry to respond to public health crises. So it really is intended to be a high bar to encourage these companies to respond. It begins, as we said earlier, with the declaration of a public health emergency by the HHS Secretary, which initiates the FDA emergency use authorization process and allows the products to be marketed until either it's approved by the traditional route, the emergency ends, or the FDA is revoked by FDA. So in one of our earlier webinars, we did talk about revocation of the EUA by FDA. And as we see here, the PrEP Act liability shield it's great in that it is very broad. The only exception in the wording of the statute itself is for willful misconduct. But on the somewhat negative side, the PrEP Act liability shield is untested because it is intended for these very rare circumstances that we find ourselves in right now. There's very little case law, but the act itself was drafted to set a high bar for protection. So in our previous COVID webinar series, we and an accompanying Medmarc blog post, we talked about what might happen in the event of FDA revoking an emergency use authorization. And the thought or the theory is because the statute is intended to encourage industry to respond to a crisis, you wouldn't want to leave this gap in the event of a product having their emergency use authorization revoked. That would open them up to all kinds of liability because their product didn't work out the way that they had initially hoped. So there isn't case law to rely on to support this I guess opinion, but it seems like the act is encouraging the protection of companies responding to the crisis. So even if the EUA is revoked, if the product was administered to a patient when the EUA was in effect, and the company did not perform any sort of willful misconduct, then you would have a solid defense that the PrEP Act shield should encompass that use of the product, whether it's the manufacturing, distribution, or administration of the product that at the time of the injury was subject to an EUA. One thing that is on the horizon, of course, is future product liability claims. And we certainly know that they're coming. And we can't forget who we're dealing with. We have a plaintiff's bar in this country that is extremely well organized. They are constantly trolling for plaintiffs. They use TV ads. I'm sure these look familiar to everyone. They are also online with mere seconds. You can have thousands of results for product liability attorneys. And there is a massive treasure trove of public information about potentially defective drugs and devices. In addition to all of the information that is out there for products that have been placed on the market through a traditional pathway, here we also have FDA's entire library of documents about responses to the COVID pandemic and any products that have potentially had their EUAs revoked. This is a topic that is incredibly popular with the media, of course, because it's affecting so many people so seriously. So any products that have had their FDA EUA revoked, they will make news. We also have the standard warning letters and adverse event reports that the plaintiff's bar will draw from. And in addition, we've polled our defense panel in the past, and they have stated that in some or most of their cases, plaintiffs become aware of causes of action frequently because of an FDA enforcement action. So in this case, if someone suffered from COVID, they believe they were injured by a product that was used during the course of their treatment and they're suffering lasting effects, whether it's true or not, they might believe that they have a product liability claim against the manufacturer, distributor, healthcare provider, or all of the above. So looking ahead, if you recall, when we started, we talked about the COVID numbers in January, where there were under 10,000 worldwide cases, 8 in the United States. And by the end of March, when things really took off and so many of us went into lockdown, the numbers were drastically different. Over 875,000 around the world, 192,000 in the United States. Well, at this point, the numbers as of November 30th were 63 million worldwide, of which 13.5 million were in the United States. Clearly, the number one topic or cause for concern, celebration, is the vaccine process. A number of companies have been working through clinical trials. Both Pfizer and Moderna have completed clinical trials and submitted applications for EUAs. The two vaccines differ in the technology that they're using to produce the vaccines themselves, and that has resulted in a difference in the way the vaccines need to be treated. The Pfizer vaccine may be more of a challenge for distribution purposes because it has to stay at a constant, extremely low temperature, lower than the average community hospital would have access to store. The Moderna, on the other hand, has more stability. So this may impact the distribution of vaccines once they have received an EUA. If a hospital or a geographic area has the capacity to store and distribute the Pfizer product at the required storage conditions, then they might have that product assigned to them, whereas Moderna is more shelf stable and might be able to withstand maybe more rural distribution. There is also a concern about how the vaccine will be distributed once the doses are available. So because of there are a couple of factors that are coming into consideration. The first is that each person who receives the vaccine requires 2 doses, either 3 weeks apart or 4 weeks apart, depending upon the manufacturer. And the estimated number of doses by the end of the year is nowhere near the amount necessary to inoculate the entire population. So it is going to be a slow process. The CDC is working on a determination of priority for access right now. And some of the early word is that they're looking at residential nursing facility staff and residents as the primary population because they have represented such an increased percentage of the COVID patient population, despite the relative low percentage of our overall population. So they are clearly among the most at risk. Once the need of that population has been met, The next likely group is healthcare providers, the people who are working in hospitals with COVID patients, those over 65, and those with health conditions that may compromise their ability to fight off the virus. Because these are, again, the groups that we have seen struggle the most in recovering from the virus itself. And then once those populations' needs have been met, then it would be open to the general population. It's looking like there may be a sufficient supply to cover the population by the end of the first half of 2021. It's unclear right now, but it's going to matter. It'll depend upon the logistics for distribution, the amount that can be manufactured, the amount that is able to be maintained, to have its stability maintained. So, if there were any shipments of the Pfizer product that are damaged due to the environmental conditions varying outside of the specifications, that could slow down the process as well. Another concern that has come about recently is the view that a segment of the population has taken toward vaccines in general. It's unclear whether some people will be less receptive than others to receiving the vaccine, and will the numbers who may choose not to receive the vaccine impact the level required for herd immunity? So that remains to be seen. It's going to take quite a lot of informational scientific marketing to ensure that the vaccine is reaching the number of people required to keep the population itself healthy and safe from the virus. Some additional concerns with the vaccines is that once they are received, although they appear to be extremely safe, that is not really one of the concerns. There have been very few adverse events reported. The concern is that people, once they receive their first dose, may consider themselves to be immune from the virus, whereas it takes the second dose and then a number of weeks afterwards to build up the antibodies to really confer that immunity. So there's concern about people who are only really partially inoculated continuing to spread the virus because they are taking fewer precautions with regard to masking, hand washing, gathering in groups. And this is all going to be coming at the end of a very difficult winter as well. We have concerns right now about the staff of hospitals holding up over this long period of time. We are talking about people who have been, fighting through this virus, which really takes a psychological toll on the healthcare providers, as we're learning, and whether they will be able to continue at this pace and sustain the work that they're doing for another 6, potentially more months through flu season. This is a major concern in rural hospitals, community hospitals, where they may not have an extensive staff. So if 1 or 2 doctors were to become sick with the virus, it may impact the facility's ability to continue to provide care to COVID patients. Also on the horizon, of course, we have a new administration that will be taking office in January, and so we're not sure what the impact will be. having this new team at the helm of HHS and FDA. But of course, I would refer you again back to our post-election outlook webinar, where we had a great discussion of some of the changes that could be ahead. So we will be seeing, of course, turnover at FDA among the political appointees. The career scientists will remain on board, as they will at CDC and other healthcare agencies. It's just the political appointees who will be changing over with the new administration. So we will be watching, listening for the priorities that are announced as all of these new positions are filled. That is the information that I have for you, but I am more than happy to answer questions if anyone has questions to discuss.
Yes, Kate, thank you. We do have some time for questions, so if you would like to, you can submit it through the Q&A panel located in your Zoom application. You did cover most of the ones that came in through the registration process, so you covered those clearly throughout your presentation, but we do have one that has come through. Do you think the PPE supply shortage issue has been corrected going forward?
So I don't. I think we are going to continue to see some issues with the PPE supply chain. Some things that were helpful initially were the declaration by FDA that they were exempting consumer fabric type face coverings, face masks, from the definition of a surgical mask that might require FDA clearance or registration with FDA in order to manufacture and sell those products. So that was really helpful in shifting the consumer market focus from purchasing PPE intended for healthcare workers to a consumer-based type product. However, I think a lot of the same issues that led to the initial shortage still exist. I think there is still a massive global demand for the products, and it's growing as we head back into the winter months. In a lot of places, we're seeing second spikes that are surpassing the initial bout of the virus. And the global supply chain has not recovered to meet that demand. In addition, there have been reports of some manufacturers of PPE, because of the uncertainty with regard to demand, that are pulling back on the volume that they're manufacturing because they don't want to be caught overstocking their inventory. So if they have ramped up production dramatically to meet the increased demands, they are potentially pulling back until they run down some inventory. But that could, if there is another dramatic surge, leave us without enough equipment again. So it's really hard to say. Again, with ventilators, we did a great job rebuilding the supply of ventilators. Now the main issue seems to be that we're struggling with the healthcare provider capacity to operate these ventilators for patients. We are short on some personnel. So the challenge remains. And I think there will be really no shortage of studies done into how supply chains existed prior to this crisis, what changes need to be made in the future, how companies choose to stock their inventory, how shelf life of products might be reevaluated, so that there isn't tremendous waste. If if you're talking about something like a glove or equipment tubing that goes with a ventilator or something like that, where it's clearly a shelf-stable product, what is the actual sustainable life of it? What are the storage conditions needed to maintain the integrity of the product so that maybe a hospital can build up a stock that would support another surge like this without having to be concerned about expiration dates that are perhaps for marketing sales purposes lower than they need to be, shorter than they need to be.
Yeah, that's a good point, because with the ventilators and you don't have the expertise to actually run the ventilators, then you're just going to have a machine sitting in storage. That's a good point. Do you see any of these changes as a result of COVID continue post-COVID, such as expanding of use of telehealth in clinical trials, as an example? Do you see that as a post-COVID improvement, actually?
I think it probably will be. I think because this has gone on for an extended period of time now, and so I think people have become accustomed to some of the inconvenient conveniences. I think that there may have to be, in order for this to continue post-COVID, there would have to be a reevaluation of the HIPAA privacy regulations so that telehealth has a better chance going forward. I think there has been a lot of advancement in platforms that providers can use that are considered sufficiently secure to have teleconferences, video conferences with patients. And it may end up being less expensive for some of these sponsors of clinical trials to consider, what must be done in a clinical setting versus through telehealth. Is it cheaper for them to have one of their investigators sitting in an office and speaking to patients over a computer, over a video conference? What kind of lab tests are necessary versus sitting and speaking to the patient? What kind of monitoring can be done through remote equipment? I think sponsors and sites, investigators alike, CROs are learning quite a lot as we sort of are forced into this new paradigm. And I think they will, I think it's going to become necessary to, figure out, take from this what works, what does not, improve what does not, going forward.
So thank you, Kate. We're anxiously awaiting 2021 with less eventful headlines. This concludes our webinar.